All right, welcome everybody to another episode of Legal Tech Week. This is the show where we talk about the top stories in legal tech and innovation. As some of you who are regulars on the show will see, I am not in my usual location, and I am also not alone. I will introduce the person sitting next to me in just a minute, but let's first just get started with who our panelists are this week. And it looks like we've got a really small group of panelists this week. We're hoping Stephanie's going to join us, but Niki, you want to kick us off with telling us who you are and what you do?
My name is Niki Black.
Niki, I can't hear you. Is that me?
Principal Legal Insight Strategist at...
Niki, we can't hear you.
We are all sorts of technical difficulties.
Yeah, I think you're on your computer mic and you're far away from it or something.
Well, Joe?
Hey. Joe Patrice from Above the Law and Thinking Like a Lawyer. I am happy to be here as per usual. And I've kicked it off. I'm not going with bourbon this week. I've moved to margaritas for the weekend. So there we go.
All right. Niki, still no good? Uh-oh. This could be a disaster-prone. Are you in your... All right, well, while you try and figure that out. All right. Niki is going to sign out. Hopefully Stephanie's going to join us. Otherwise, you're going to have just Joe and me. But anyway, while Niki's sorting that out, let me just start by talking about where I am and who this is sitting next to me. So I am in Chicago at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law at a conference called SubTech. Sitting here with me is somebody not a stranger to the podcasting world, Dan Linna, who's a professor here at Northwestern, focused on, and there's Stephanie now. People come and go so quickly around here. We just lost Niki, we now have Stephanie, all right, well, and Stephanie, I'm at Northwestern. This poor guy's thinking, what kind of a podcast is this? This is like...
No, this is great. This is real. This is real stuff on the fly here. Yeah.
Anyway, Dan Linna, professor at the law school and organizer of this conference, along with you're kind of the principal organizer this year. Mark Lawrenson is somebody who's been organizing this conference for, what did he say, 30 years or something like
Since
that?
1990, yeah, so 34 years. Right,
yeah. So I thought I'd just take a second, let Dan sit down for a minute and maybe kind of talk a little bit about this conference and what it's been about. I can tell you it's my first time being here. It's a conference that happens every 2 years, I believe, and has been in a variety of exotic locations around the world. A really interesting conference from my vantage point, because there are a lot of people here that I know of and have always wanted to meet but never had the chance to meet. But it's a diverse group with a lot of backgrounds, heavy academic focus. And a lot of the programs, a lot of what we're talking about has an academic focus to it. You might be surprised to know we're talking a bit about AI here, but it's been, even there, it's been in a really interesting way, I think, in terms of some of the really both practical and scholarly ways people are going at this technology. So anyway, Dan, why don't you talk a little bit about the conference and what it's about and what your impressions have been?
Yeah, well, the whole idea behind SubTech is getting into substantive technology, right? Technology used for substantive legal services delivery in practice, in law schools. And even though the majority of the people here are academics, those academics, the most of them are working with law firms, tech companies, right? So there's strong engagement with the real world. A lot of them are running labs where they're building technology tools. The agenda has had a lot of AI and generative AI, but it's been more than that. There's been sessions on other topics. And you can imagine in 1990, the group of international law scholars who were thinking about substantive technology was actually relatively small compared to what it looks like now. But even then, there are not a lot of places for this group of people to convene. And so Mark Lawrenson started this with Larry Farmer back in 1990, been convening every couple of years. And this is our second time in Chicago, so it's been great to get her in here. And we have people from South America, from Europe, from Asia, and then of course a lot of people from the United States and Canada as well here talking about substantive legal technology.
Yeah, I've been trying to think about what my takeaways are from this conference. This is day 2, and we're, what is it, 2 o'clock in the afternoon here in Chicago, so we're getting near the end of it. And I don't know that I've had a chance to assimilate it all, but one thing I think I've really been thinking a lot about is last week on this show, we talked about an article Joe had written where the title was something like, "Is this as good as it gets for generative AI and law?" I mean, kind of talking about this question of whether we kind of reached a peak or a plateau or something in terms of the development of generative AI. And I think my takeaway from this conference has been, boy, that's definitely not the case, because it's been really interesting to hear about some of the research that's being done into, how this can be used in law schools to train future generations of lawyers, but also in better understanding the potential practical applications of this technology now and into the future. And it just makes me, sort of think about the fact that we're really still are in the early innings, to use that overworked baseball analogy on AI. But
yeah, I mean, I think it's just so important to think about what the time horizon is. I mean, I wrote an op-ed for CNN back in December where I said I thought what we're really going to see is, there's more than a little bit. There's too much hype about this technology right now. And so that we're kind of going into this trough of disillusionment a little bit. I mean, it turns out ChatGPT and even, building apps around, when you have access to the APIs and things, it's not just an easy button. It turns out there's a lot of work in software development and knowledge management that needs to go into these tools. And you're seeing some of that here, right, where people are talking about, and not just retrieval augmented generation, but thinking about how you bring different tools together in different systems, especially with a real understanding of the specific problems you're trying to solve and the kind of things that you can do to build systems that are more and more capable. And what I think we'll start seeing, especially in, like if we push out just a little bit to 2 years and then 5 years and 10 years, right? And then the way that there's kind of a flywheel effect here too, because so many of the problems we have is that, lawyers do things in all these different ways. We don't really have good data. Some of this work began a decade ago where we saw some improvements here, but now there's been a real, right, where you had a handful of law firms looking at this. It's many law firms looking at this, many law schools looking at this. There's starting to become a body of research that's helping push this forward. And I think we're really going to see the fruit of that labor in the next couple of years and then beyond that.
Yeah.
So I guess my article, my thing wasn't that there wasn't possibilities for it. My article was worrying about the underlying, and it was about the Goldman Sachs report and whether the underlying engine is going to run afoul of, we don't have enough electricity, or it's just not cost effective to train the underlying models. So maybe to some extent, maybe what you're talking about doesn't involve that, and that it's figuring out ways in which the underlying engines that we have now, even if they don't get much better, how we can still apply them in creative ways.
Yeah, I think that's just right. I mean, I think there's a lot of doubt about the extent to which generative AI itself, right, we can just keep creating bigger models and things, and then it's going to get more and more capable. And, the jury's kind of out on that. But what we're seeing now is even smaller models can, and there was some research presented here about that, right? Smaller models can be quite capable when deployed in the right context, used properly. And that's exciting because when we're thinking about access to justice, like thinking about some of these tools that you could push to a smartphone that someone could use to be able to do something. So I think the key to me is understanding that generative AI is unlikely to be good at solving these big complex problems. But if you think about it as, this is another tool in the toolbox. It's amazing at natural language understanding, language generation. There's a lot of ways that we can deploy it that can be really useful. My concern is that there's so much focus on the generative AI aspect of it that people won't do the knowledge engineering kind of part of it. We've talked about ontologies here some
Yeah,
today,
yeah,
and
yeah.
the age-old problem of measuring quality, and then that's important too, because if you want to train a system to do really well at a particular task, then you want high-quality data. And if it's just like every lawyer doing it a different way, and that's our training data set now, well, then you want to move beyond that.
Yeah. But one of the interesting points that came up a couple of times yesterday was around the difficulty of modeling what lawyers do. And the fact that not all lawyers do things the same way, do the same thing in the same way, and that in trying to develop models or tools using AI in law practice, it can be really difficult to kind of say, here's how you do this, or here's how it should be doing this. And there seems to be, I mean, there's definitely a couple of different minds on how achievable that is. But I thought
Well,
that was
yeah,
really
there's a
fascinating.
divide. There's a divide on this, and I have a real strong opinion about this. I think it's like we went through this industrial revolution where all these things were done in the craft mode. Even medicine was really kind of like individual doctors and their communities of practice. Evidence took this empirical turn, right? It's evidence-based, and I think there's absolutely a lot of areas of law practice where we can say, well, why are we all doing it in these different ways, right? Let's talk about measuring outcomes. Let's talk about what actually produces, better results, and that's the direction we should be going.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
of course, there's aspects of law practice that are a little more art than they are science, but undoubtedly, there's ways we can become much more evidence-based in many of the things that lawyers are doing.
Yeah, yeah. Any questions or comments, either from the chat or a couple of comments in the chat here about this? But before I let Dan get back to his test time training, Promising Architecture proposed this month is test time training, which was developed over the course of the years, half by researchers. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I switched to my own computer. Well, one thing that I thought was interesting in terms of the discussion you were just having about trying to figure out lawyers' workflows and how to apply AI to it. It's a similar struggle that you find with practice management, right? So when you have practice management for specific practice areas, like so in my company, there's CasePeer for PI, there's DocketWise for immigration attorneys, and then there's like Wealth Counsel for trust and estates lawyers. Those products are in some ways easier to create and market because those workflows are very specific and unique to that practice area. And when you're trying to provide general practice management, it becomes a lot more difficult because lawyers have so many different practice areas, and then each lawyer uniquely deals with their workflows in different ways. And so I think there's similar pain points and challenges with rolling generative AI out into law firms as well, because, like you said, I mean, there's just so much variation from one practice area to the next, and then from one lawyer or law firm to the next as well. So it's just a challenging industry to roll tech out into in some ways.
Yeah, how can you be all things to all people?
Right.
Yeah, I think, the clients, I think, are continuing to be a force driving for more standardization here. And because I think you see it from clients more and more that when they see matters being handled in different ways by different lawyers, the same, I mean, Niki, you're talking about too, like the problem across a whole firm that there should be more consistency in the way matters are handled, or there could be at least, and there could be efficiencies to be gained from that. But on the other hand, when you get down to the lawyer level, and even in the fanciest of firms, right, and there's very different approaches a lot of times to, even for the same client, right? Clients, I think, are starting to notice things like that more often too, and including because of the data we're gathering about matters, and there's real questions about whether that's producing value for the client or not. And I think the idea is that it's not. So.
Right, yeah. And one of the biggest challenges with firms large and small is that the people that have the decision-making power, the managing partners, the partners that have I'm having a mind blank. What the partners that are the
rainmakers,
equity partners. What?
Okay.
Yeah. They're the ones that have the decision-making power, and they also tend to be older. So sometimes they have a hard time getting them to even use the new technology, let alone change their processes, right? And they're the ones that have the most power, and also rainmakers as well. Certain people have high levels of power in firms, and they're the ones that are often the most resistant to changes in terms of how they practice. And so that can also be a challenge both in tech implementation and process changing within firms. Change management can be very difficult.
Yeah, and I think, I think one part of the trick here is identifying opportunities where it's really in their benefit. And I think part of this is like selling it to clients and also to partners and firms. Just a quick anecdote, one of my former students, Jordan Galvin, who is now leading data governance efforts at Perkins Coie, she was on a panel with us at the ABA, and she was talking about some of the equity partners she's working with who are really excited about better data governance and better use of data, and they think that it can make a real big difference to their bottom line, right? And so, I think part of this is like trying to get a sense for, is there been a real total transformation of how law firms are doing things? We've seen a huge increase in interest, I think, in things that are happening. But some of these things where there have been real change, I think it's small, but right, you got to have incremental early change before then it starts really taking off. So I think we see signs that these things are happening, and it doesn't take every equity partner in the firm to change. It takes just a handful, and then that starts spreading, and then then maybe it really takes off.
All right, well, anybody else have a question or comment for Dan before I let him get back to the business of conferencing here? And Dan, thanks a lot. Great to see you.
Yeah. It's nice to join. Thanks for joining us here in Chicago, Bob.
Yeah, it's been fun. I'm glad to hear. All right, see ya. And actually, it was funny. There's, like I said, several of the people who are often in our audience are here at the conference, and I invited a few of them to stop by, but whether they will or not, I don't know. And anyway, all right. Well, maybe it's appropriate to go from that to lawyers' opinions on generative AI, because Niki, you've got a new survey, I guess, talking about that. And meanwhile, I'm going to try and get my AirPods back on.
Oh, I did, and you know what? It's I'd actually pulled all the data in a document really quickly on my other computer so that I'd have it readily accessible. And here I am on this computer instead. So let me pull up my, unfortunately, it looks like TypePad, which is where my blog is hosted, is impacted by that huge tech failure that everyone's having. So it's hard to get the page up. 1 second, let me just grab my post about it, so I at least have some of the data points in front of me. But essentially what I did, it was just Thomson Reuters, it was about professions, not just law firms, but it covered law firms and included data about law firms and general counsel. And a lot of it dealt with generative AI, big surprise, right? But I love seeing new surveys as they come out about generative AI because it is changing so quickly, and some of the data points seem to be moving and others are not. And I think the one that I'm noticing that is moving the least is actual AI adoption beyond the individual level, because that takes time, right, for most law firms to do that. So one of the things that there are a couple of data points that I thought were interesting. One was that 51% of legal professionals think AI is appropriate for law firms, even though 85%, despite 85 acknowledging that it has a potential application. So 85% understand that it can be used in a favorable way, but only 51% think it's appropriate for law firms to use it, which I thought was an interesting data point and an interesting approach, because I hadn't seen that question asked. Like, do you think it's appropriate for firms to use it? 77% are particularly concerned about the unauthorized practice of law being one of the significant threats posed by generative AI. And I think that's really interesting because that goes to the economic interests of law firms, right? If just as like legal Zoom poses a threat, generative AI does so exponentially more so. And so there's clearly a concern that it's going to start replacing lawyers' jobs. And I've seen that depending on the audience that I've been speaking to over the past year or so. Certain practice areas seem a lot more concerned about that potential threat. And another thing I thought was really interesting was when they asked firms if they were recruiting new hires based upon AI knowledge, only 2% said they're requiring that skill, and 17% saw it as a nice to have. And I think it was 51% just weren't even concerned about that, or that wasn't an issue. And then when they broke it down, it was much more, wasn't surprising to see that it was more like IT and certain roles in a firm that they were more likely to require that type of knowledge versus others. But it's a really interesting report. And it does have a lot of really, it had some interesting data points on pricing as well. And I don't have those in front of me because I had to switch computers, but it talked about, there was a discussion about flat fee billing and whether lawyers thought that it was going to start to force that. And I think it was something like 51 or 2% thought that that was something that may start to happen because of generative AI, which I thought was interesting, that lawyers are considering that possibility. So those were some of the data points that I can remember off the top of my head. I can't believe that I pulled it all together in a document. I'm on a different computer, that I wanted to dive into a few other ones even more so. But it's an interesting report, and it also provides discussion about other professions as well and how they're approaching generative AI and comparing even how general counsel, in-house counsel versus law firms and private practice attorneys are dealing with it. Well, not, law firms, lawyers and law firms. And it's just interesting to see the different approaches and the different perspectives on it. And so it's definitely a report at least worth taking a look at, I think.
This conference has been one of those conferences where it's just a whole series of 10-minute, or less presentations. And so in my mind are rolling around a whole bunch of things that I need to make sense of. But one of the presentations yesterday was just somebody's been trying to do some research into the issue of trust of AI within legal settings. And it was a study that's, I think, either just been published or about to be published, in which they did something interesting, which was they took these sort of two versions of a contract. And both versions were actually drafted by a human. And one was a little bit more concise, the other one was longer and went into more detail. But then they took these different control groups or study groups or whatever they are. And with one group, they told them, this one was drafted by AI and this one was drafted by a human, even though they were both drafted by a human, and asked them a series of questions about it. And then the other group, they switched it and said, this one was drafted by AI, this one was drafted by a human, and asked them the same questions. And what they found were, whichever one they said was drafted by AI, people tended to trust it less, and sort of be more critical of not just the substantive terms of the contract, but even the way it was written and the grammar and the wording and that kind of a thing. So it's just, obviously just evidence that even, maybe lawyers are just not ready to fully trust AI, even if it's not really AI. It's just if you plant the seed in their mind that it's AI, they're going to be more skeptical of it.
I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing, given the hallucination rates right now. I think healthy skepticism about anything drafted by AI is probably a good thing. And even just in terms of competence, it's probably a good thing. I think lawyers should be reviewing stuff more carefully. Like, good segue to Joe's would be, Joe's, what he's going to talk about is a clear indication of that. But I did find the data point, it was 39%, just to clarify. Thought that alternative fees might start to be impacted by generative or the use of them, not 52 or whatever I said, so 39%. I was able to pull the blog post up, so maybe that was a temporary glitch when I couldn't access it. But that might be a segue into Joe's if no one else has anything else to add. About carefully reading documents and not trusting AI, but.
Yeah, I'll take that segue and pass it off to Joe.
All right then. So yeah, sorry. All right. Yeah. No. So I have an interesting story. It pulled together a bunch of different threads. In some ways, it's not an AI story directly, but it's a story about something that will be very much accelerated by that. A lawyer was contacted out of the blue by another lawyer to talk about the case that they were on. and he had no idea what they were talking about. He had no idea why they thought he was on this case. He was right there on the docket, but he didn't remember it. Now, I know a lot of lawyers. We, go out, party too hard, black out, and then start filing pleadings. But in this instance, that's not what he did. He actually had done nothing, but the an organization that was representing somebody pro bono uh, had to file an emergency motion. They used Trellis and presumably some kind of AI-ish thing, whether it was for the search function or to try and draw stuff together. Whatever it was, they went through the body of stuff on Trellis and were able to find pleading that was exactly what they wanted. They felt a guy's house was about to be foreclosed on. They didn't really feel like they had a lot of time. They went ahead and filed this thing. They went ahead and filed this thing without ever bothering to sign it. Indeed, leaving on the original guy's signature and bar number and everything, leading to him being docketed by. So that's a problem. Attorneys should be paying more attention. They should at least know that they have to sign things. All of this is true. The part that was interesting to me was there was some blowback on the part of some lawyers talking about this case and saying, this is a huge problem. AI, people are using AI and stealing our work product and such. And all I could think was the publicly filed document. Like, are we really going down the road of trying to bolt intellectual property law on top of public filings? Seems like a problem to me. On the other hand, at a certain point, AI could potentially get to a point where it is stealing the work that people do and causing problems for the profession. Where do we draw the line? What kind of regulatory mechanism is good for that? And finally, the part that I thought was relevant was this is a pro bono matter, and I think that had the organization been getting paid for it, they probably wouldn't have just lifted somebody's filing and rolled with it, but they did here. And if that's the case, it struck me that if we think that this sort of technology has benefits potentially for bridging the access to justice gap, I think we have to kind of assume that potentiality involves the level that it has to let people copy stuff. If it's not the quick and easy copying, then I'm not altogether sure it can do too much for people on the wrong side of the justice gap.
I mean, that kind of isn't to some extent, isn't that kind of copying happening all the time in legal? I mean, it's like if you go to, what was the Thomson Reuters put out their co-counsel drafting thing this week, right? And one of the, what it does is help you find starting documents to draft a document. And one of its sources is the SEC database, right? Which is you're just going in and copying somebody else's contract that they wrote and using that as your starting point to draft a contract.
So there was a case recently that had nothing to do with AI, but that is relevant here, where a boutique firm based out of Boston, I think, was they multiple co-defendants, and a bigger firm, I'm now blanking on which, Winston and Strawn, I believe. A bigger firm said, oh, you filed this motion to dismiss, that applies, we're all similarly situated co-defendants, we just took the same, we thought it was great, we took what you did and put our names on it. And the boutique sued them, saying that it violated their copyright. Now, they had already filed it, so I don't think we're a common law system. And the thing about being a common law system is plagiarism is kind of the whole point, right? Like, you're supposed to be doing what people have done before. But that case settled, but it opened up the same sort of logic as this AI issue, right? Like, if we go down the road of thinking, a point that was raised by someone in the chat directly to us is, how our client's going to feel about how they've shelled out a bunch of money for a brief and then they see it get lifted and used for someone else. And like you say, Bob, like, that is kind of something that happens all the time because, again, common law system. But is there some sort of line where a certain level of copying is too much? And I don't like that world. I don't think there's a great place to draw that line. So I kind of am do what you want to do so long as it's public. But that case, which I'd written about when the copyright case, which I'd written about on that ground, came back to me when this story happened and made me start wondering: are we, like a lot of other artistic industries, going to try to square peg round hole intellectual property rights onto how we deal with AI?
Yeah, I mean, hasn't this been decided in terms of court filings, at least in federal court, as to whether they're protected by any kind of copyright? Or
Great point. So in the boutique suing Winston and Strawn case, they cited two cases that they thought were on point. One was against Thomson Reuters. Ultimately, it didn't really help them in that Thomson Reuters ultimately prevailed in that case anyway. But it was about the idea of taking someone's filing and then profiting off of it by compiling it in a forms library or whatever, which isn't the case when you're just using it to help out your client. The second case that actually was interesting and nuanced is a case where there were a bunch of defendants. One explicitly said, after looking at the draft motion, you know what, I'm not going to join the joint defense agreement, and then took the draft motion and filed it before anyone else did. And in that instance, they said, look, this wasn't public yet, and you're trying to profit off of something that hadn't yet been on the public docket, so you were in trouble. But those are the only two cases they were able to come up with for that proposition in the first place.
all right. That might sort of segue into a different story I had this week. Only again on this issue of lawyers' trust of AI. There was the Leap. I wrote about it, I think, on Monday of this week. Leap Legal Software came out with a couple of AI tools in their platform, and they're, in some ways similar to what other practice management companies are talking about in terms of developing AI tools for their platform, where you can ask questions about your matters or just engage in some general AI chat. But I thought there was an interesting spin in it, in that it has a capability to ask a legal question about certain matters. It only covered like family law in New Jersey and trust and estates in Massachusetts or something like that at this point. But you can ask a legal question, or you could ask it to draft a document, and like any generative AI, it'll give you an answer or it'll give you a document. But then they've got a little button you can press, which is like, I think it says verify. And they take the response given by the AI and send it off to a human. And have a human lawyer who is trained in that area of law in that particular jurisdiction review the answer that the AI has given, and then either validate that it was correct or provide the correct answer if it was not correct. And they say they can turn it around in like 3 or 4 hours. No guarantee, I think they said within 24 hours, but in many cases, 3 or 4 hours, they can turn around and give you a verification or a validation that the AI answer was in fact a correct answer. And I thought about that in the context, last week we were talking about the citator products and the fact that VLEX had come out with a citator that, again, where they kind of found that they could use generative AI up to a point to validate the results of whether a case was good law or not, but there was about 40% of the cases where they needed to bring in humans to look at the work and validate whether this could be done. So it seems to be, I don't know if 2 instances constitute a trend, but here's a couple of different products over the last couple of weeks where humans in the loop or lawyers in the loop become a kind of a critical part of the AI deployment. I thought that was interesting.
It's interesting because that was what was happening with AI that predated generative AI, right? Like all the legal AI tools, initially they were like, redlining this contract. And sometimes they just throw humans on the back end without telling anything because they realized the accuracy rates weren't good. And then it just became more common than not to have humans on the back end verifying things. And then they would just kind of sneak that onto their website. And when generative AI came out, it seemed like the vast majority of, like, I remember going to Legal Week post pandemic and talking to one of the newer redlining companies, contract redlining, and that person saying, well, we don't have a human like everybody else, and trying to tell me that their product was different. And I think I know who it was, but I won't say because I'm not 100% sure. But theirs was different because there was no human and their algorithms were superior. And then generative AI came out and suddenly that was kind of off the table, this idea of humans in the background. But then here we are, a year and a half later, and we're starting to see that happening with generative AI too. And I think it is because, like, I've been writing about AI since like 2000 and I want to say 17, like tracking it, actively trying to talk to companies about it whenever I go to conferences. And I've always maintained, and I'm not unique in maintaining this, one of the biggest hurdles is trust. And it's, if they're not going to trust the outcome, then they're not going to use the product, because the whole value is that it provides an output quickly, but if it's not accurate, what's the point? And so I think we're finding that same problem. People want people to actually use their AI tools, and they're not going to use them if there's these hallucination problems, and if the accurate output's not accurate. So I think it's interesting to see that trend starting, and I think it is a trend. I think two is not quite a trend, but I think it's the beginning of a trend. And it'll be interesting to see what it looks like.
All right. Stephanie, you're very quiet today.
I know. I'm like quadruple tasking. I'm sorry. We're so close to hiring a new reporter, y'all. We're like in it.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Did you have anything you wanted to talk about this week? You didn't put, I don't think you put anything in the storyline.
I'm like, what did I even write about this week? What did I do?
You're asking us?
Yeah,
That's a
that's
bad
fine.
week.
But I know. What did I do?
We have,
Oh my
Nikki's
gosh.
been like holding back on us. She's had the big investment in her company this week, and we were like, I don't know how that went right over me. I totally missed it.
That just came out in our roundup just now. We put it in there.
Yeah,
It
I
even
saw
made
that.
the
Thanks for
headline.
the coverage.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
no, it's exciting. Our a new private equity company is joining and taking a significant buying a significant stake in the company, and our one of our PE investors, TA, is staying with us as well, and it's super exciting because there's lots of opportunity for growth and innovation in the future, and we're really excited about what that's going to look like for us. And so it's very cool.
Details are vague. Is this a majority interest or do we not know?
Uh, I mean, it's not a majority interest. They are, I don't know the exact percentages. And, if you want to, you are interested in, uh, doing more of a deep dive into it, maybe we can have someone join us next week that can sort of speak on behalf of the company. I'm not really in a position to do that, especially in this context, other than sort of describing what happened, but we can certainly do that next time if you're interested.
Yeah, makes sense.
So,
All right.
Yeah, I feel like we've just had like a million different funding news pieces this week. We've started writing more about funding, and then everyone sends us news about their funding. It's like a
Yeah.
self-perpetuating cycle.
Did you see, I forget if we talked about it here, but a couple of weeks ago, Richard Tromans posted something where I think he basically said, I'm not going to cover funding news anymore. It wasn't exactly that, but because maybe I'm sure there's exceptions to every rule, but there is so much funding news that it almost stops sounding like news anymore in a lot of cases. I mean, a lot of seed raises or fairly minor in the scheme of things raises, and they start to seem less. I mean, I remember when it was like every single legal tech funding that happened just seemed like the biggest news because it was just the beginning of a trend, and it just wasn't happening all that much. And now I mean, as one person writing a blog, certainly can't keep up with it all. And I debate often to what extent my readers in particular care about it. I mean, I think they care about the larger deals or the more significant deals. I mean, when it's an established company and there's an investment deal, but a lot of it just starts to seem like business as usual almost, in a sense.
It's interesting though, because like you said, it used to be a really big deal when there was any kind of funding in legal tech. And then a really big deal when there were acquisitions. And then we're like, oh my God, there's like an acquisition every day. And now we're like, there's funding and, all these other things happening investment and funding, and it's all happening every single day. And it's not even news anymore. But that's a really interesting, trend though, because it used to be that legal was not the place to invest in. It was, there was an unclear value prop for these, PE and venture capital companies. And now the value prop is really clear. And so it's exciting that there is all this investment, because it's going to be better for lawyers, I think, because, the more investment, the more innovation you're going to see. It's going to be able to drive innovation, and it's going to be able to, provide more for like R&D, so companies can really understand what lawyers actually need versus what they think they need, or a company that has one lawyer who practice in one area, that's the founder, thinks everybody practices that way, rather than really talking to lawyers and figuring out what do they need. And so I think it provides a lot of potential for products that are really responsive and are what lawyers have been asking for and what they need. So I think it's exciting, even if it does seem like it's a dime a dozen every day.
And I thought it's been interesting, particularly this week. I mean, it's a good way for us to find out new companies too, like now that they're coming out of the woodwork for us. Because like the ones we got this week were, I mean, like Leia, which is becoming a bigger name, but I mean, they were like UK, Sweden, Belgium, and Brazil that came out to us this week. And it was like a Brazilian CLM company. And I feel like it's been a while since we've gotten like a CLM company funding come out. And like, in a Brazilian company. So I'm like, I don't know. It's at least that. I mean, that's keeping it interesting. Like, I like hearing about new companies and new players that we haven't, because I feel like for so long we've been so like US centric, except with a few notable exceptions. But so yeah,
Yeah.
that's it.
Yeah, this conference that I'm at is small, but there's been actually a strong international contingent of people who are attending it. I was just sitting at lunch just before we started talking to the guy who's the president of Claros, which is an Argentinian-based company that's using sort of blockchain technology in dispute resolution and doing some really interesting things in that area. And there's been a number of several other international people here represented talking about some of what they're doing.
There was another, I didn't submit it as a thing to talk about, but have we exhausted our list of things to talk about?
Well, we've exhausted our list. I don't know, somebody mentioned, do we want to talk about the whole CrowdStrike thing? I haven't really paid attention, honestly. So I don't know is there a legal tech angle to all of that? But
one of the 5 things I'm trying to do right now is publish an article on the various court systems that are down or have been down all day because of the
really?
thing. So
yeah. Was New York one of them? Did I see that somewhere?
yeah, these are some New York courts, Pennsylvania, California, Maryland, Michigan, Idaho. By the time at the end of this call, I'll have hit publish. I can let you know.
Good. I'm glad I can give you some time to get some work done here while we're.
Yeah.
I thought Joe's stories, another one of his stories was interesting about the judge that was live streaming a sexual assault trial. I think it was a child sexual trial without telling anybody. Live streaming it on YouTube.
Yeah.
We could talk about that. I thought
without telling anybody? What was that?
Yeah, I'll post the
So
link.
no, that was an interesting one. So in Texas, judges are allowed to cameras in the courtroom is up to the judge's discretion. Most of them who choose to do it say like, oh, I'm going to have these in my courtroom, and they have a bunch of things. There are rules about, for instance, you can't put up sidebars and so on. These are all processes that are supposed to be dealt with. There's not actually a specific rule that you have to tell anyone that you're doing it, but given that you have to abide by all of these sidebars or whatever, sidebar restrictions, whatever, everyone knows it. So they didn't write that part in because it was kind of assumed. What this judge did was install a bunch of spy cams and didn't tell anybody and started like broadcasting on YouTube this trial, which was aggravated sexual assault trial against where a minor victim. The case. So the good news is it got stopped before the juvenile took the stand. So good because there are laws to prevent that from happening in prevent that kind of identification from happening in Texas. But what happened is all of the jury selection process was put up. It is a one party consent state, but the prosecutors point out the judge left the room for a while and kept it live streaming, and the prosecutors then left, and the defense lawyers were caught on live stream discussing who they were going to strike and everything. This only comes to light because in a different courtroom, a DA gets told, "You guys understand you're on YouTube, right?" Which prompted them to do some investigation and realize what was going on. So right before opening arguments, they pulled the judge aside and said, "It's come to our attention that you have decided to live stream us." Ultimately, after pointing out that was going to be a problem when they put a child on the stand, the judge shut it all down. But it is a testament to how cameras in the courtroom may be a fine idea, but handed cameras in the courtroom is not.
Wow.
I thought it was really interesting. I do a roundup every Friday of news stories or sort of legal tech intersections. And I included that in it because I just thought it was such an interesting situation. And like the fact that the judge did not seemingly think this through or have any, it just seems blind to the issues that created. And I thought that was interesting too, but it was pretty outrageous in my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, as you say, John, whenever there are sanctioned live streams from courts, they are tightly controlled, and they're often controlled literally from the bench, with the judge is having the ability to kind of mute or turn off the camera or whatever as appropriate, and the camera is positioned in certain ways within a courtroom to protect certain people if they feel that that's necessary. So. Well, we ought to just invite that live streaming judge on here, and you can just he could do a trial on our show while we're all talking.
Yeah.
We'll do voiceovers, like what was that, Mystery something theater? We can just do like
Mystery Science Theater 3000.
Mystery yeah. That's the one. Yeah.
Are we gonna have to redo our cameras in the courtroom?
Yeah. If we get invited to ever do that again. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, well, that might be it. Was that the one you were going to raise, Niki, or I'm confused?
Yeah, I thought that'd be an interesting one to talk about. It's in a good intersection of law and tech and sort of outrageous story that's always fun to cover. And Joe did a good job with it, as always.
All right. Well, we will be, some of us will be, I know Steve and I and Gene will all be at AALL over the next couple of days. I go from here to there. And then, so if anybody's going to be at AALL, look for us hanging around there. And ILTA's just around the corner. It's coming up fast. So
yeah, I can report that not only is the Gaylord sold out, but the Inn at Gaylord is sold out. So I had to go to a different one across the street. People don't have hotels yet.
Sounds like it might be really well attended then. I'm looking forward to it.
And AALL just put out a thing this morning saying the Hyatt is 100% sold out, and if you're going to be even a day late for your reservation, not even, I guess if you're not going to be at your reservation at time, they're just going to cancel your room. So that's probably pretty well attended too. We're back. Conferences are back.
Oh yes, I just mentioned PDOOM. Are we still doing PDOOM?
Oh yeah, okay. PDOOM.
I haven't been on in a while.
We did it last week. Yes.
We
I think we were all a little more optimistic last week.
I'll go. I'm probably more than I have been. I've been mostly 0. I'm probably more like 20. Not that I think AI is going to kill us, but I think dumb people trying to do things with AI are going to kill us. They're going to do some copying of stuff and filing things that shouldn't matter, and that's the problem.
Oh, PDOM doesn't have to be solely AI related, does it? I didn't know.
Exactly.
No,
Okay.
no,
There's so many
no.
things that might kill us, y'all. Sorry.
So did you say a number, Joe? I forget. What was your number?
20. Yeah.
20. Okay, okay. We should start charting these things. We should get some data analysts to help us keep track of all this. So Stephanie, you brought it up. What's your PDUM looking like? Like so you're about to hire a reporter, so it's probably you're probably
Oh
pretty.
my gosh. My PDUM will go down after we get another reporter. I don't know. I haven't been on the show in a few weeks. I don't know if you remember what my last PDUM was. Oh, my PDUM was great because I was in London. I feel like I was in London last time I was here, and I was like, I'm worlds away. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, I'll just go a nice middle 50 right now. Could go either way.
yeah. That's right. You were in London because it was right around the time of the debate, and
Yep, it
some
was.
of us were advising you might want to just stay over there and not come back.
Oh yeah, no, I should have yeah, I seriously thought about it. But yeah. But I had to come back because I had tickets to see Alanis Morissette. It was totally worth it. By the way, serious. Totally worth it. Yeah.
All right, Nikki, what's your
Uh,
PDUM?
I feel like I always am like doom and gloom and like up in the 80s. So I'm gonna go with I'm gonna reset my P dooms to closer to 50. And if it goes higher than 50, then it's really bad. So I'm gonna say 52%. Um, some of the house issues that I talked about last time, which have nothing to do with technology, we've solved some problems, so that's really good. But then, like my roundup today of different news stories, uh, I'm becoming increasingly concerned with law enforcement's use of technology and data privacy and just privacy implications, whether it's drones being used or facial recognition tech being used in weird ways, both by law enforcement and um, private actors, and also just, the robots, like, the robots are alarming and our robot overlords are going to take over at some point. And so I'm going to go to 52 just because of some of the trends that have been on my radar this week have been a little alarming.
All right. Well, I've totally tuned out politics this week because I've been traveling a lot. So that makes me feel more optimistic about the world. And frankly, this hearing a lot of the presentation this come, there's a lot of work being done on really, within academic settings on doing research and in training law students to be using AI in serving access to justice, not just in law practice, but really in targeting in on access to justice issues. And there were a number of applications demonstrated here that, again, no single one of them is kind of like going to change the world, but they're going to have small incremental impacts on access to justice. And so in light of that, I think I'm feeling pretty good about the world and even about AI right now. So I'm probably going to be, I'll go like a 20 like Joe. I'll stick around that number. All right, well, I hope everybody has a good week. And next week, we'll be back to report on whatever happens next week, and as well as give you an update on AAL and how that went. And see you all then. Thanks for being here today.
Bye all.
Hi.